It's a very great pleasure, somewhat belatedly today, to welcome you to our new building. I'm sure you'll agree it's not only an extraordinary building, it is designed to reflect a commitment to entrepreneurship and innovation. Its design is, as the architect intended it to be, from the inside out. So a very strong emphasis on collaborative spaces, on interactive spaces, on a connection with other faculties as well, because as Ian Chubb pointed out in one of his throwaway remarks that we know and love earlier today, you can't trust business schools to do entrepreneurship on their own. It's much better to have them working with scientists, engineers, designers, and I think that's really the purpose of this building, to ensure that we do create a collaborative environment within UTS. And it's the way I think we're seeing SMEs and entrepreneurship being developed as areas of study and practice in universities in other parts of the world. Most recently, I visited the Cornell Tech Experiment or Initiative in Manhattan. It's a collaboration between Cornell University and Technion, which brings together scientists, engineers, and the business school in an entrepreneurial hub, very well funded, I might say, by New York City and by private interests to shift the balance somewhat of entrepreneurship in the US from the West to the East Coast. And of course, we're thinking of very similar things in Australia. And it's been the theme of the report that I'm involved in with the Senate Economic References Committee that Emma just mentioned. It's the inquiry into the Senate Innovation System, and hopefully it now has a lot more resonance with a commitment by a new Prime Minister as well. But the two things that have emanated most strongly from the 182 submissions to this inquiry, which differentiate it from for example, the Cutler Review a few years ago, is the emphasis on collaboration, not in any transactional sense, but in the sense of an ecosystem, and a big emphasis on SMEs and entrepreneurship, and particularly on entrepreneurial startups. And we're right in the middle here at UTS of an entrepreneurial precinct. We have 3 times the density of entrepreneurial startups here compared with the next ranked postcode in Australia, lots of incubators, co-working spaces. It's something that's grown very organically, and it's very exciting to work with it. But we also know that we have a big research and innovation system out there, $9.7 billion of funding. If we threw it up in the air now, where would we want it to land? And that's an interesting question for us, among others, in this last session of the day. I think we've sort of narrowed down the participants to the enthusiasts now, and this is something that is a vexing question for public policy in Australia. We have all of our funding spread across 13 portfolios, across 150 line items in the budget. There have been 60 reviews of the innovation system in the last 15 years, only 4 or 5 of which actually refer to each other. Why is this in Australia? I do not know. But we are in what we might call a post-mining boom economy now. We do need to find new sources of growth and productivity, and SMEs and startups are part of that. Not just startups, of course, but a very important role here, and we'll bring this out in our discussion, for SMEs in transforming into globalised organisations, into what we sometimes call micro-multinationals. There's a big role as well for specialisation, smart specialisation as it's sometimes called, in global markets and value chains. So it's a new era of challenge for Australian public policy and for our entrepreneurs, and we have an absolutely fabulous panel, very distinguished panel with us this afternoon. And so may I introduce everyone. Doron Ben-Meir is the inaugural Executive Director of Research, Innovation and Commercialisation at the University of Melbourne and CEO of University of Melbourne Commercial. I've known Doron for a number of years, certainly in his previous role as the CEO of Commercialisation Australia. That's probably the way in which many of you already know him, where he really had a start-up in a government institution and delivered on it in a very effective way. Now he's in the university sector. We have Alan Finkel, AO, who is still Chancellor of Monash University, but only until the end of the year, and who knows what will happen after that. But again, a very distinguished background, Chairman of the Australian Centre of Excellence for All-Sky Astrophysics, Executive Chairman of STARL Education, and the list goes on. You can see it in your flyer and brochure. Alan was a director of NASDAQ-listed company Molecular Devices and the Chief Technology Officer of Better Place Australia. Russell Howard is the Head of Commercial Strategy at the Kinghorn Centre for Clinical Genomics at the Garvan Institute. He's come back to Australia after 30 years in the US. He's founded a number of companies, including MaxiGen, which is a company he took public after 18 months and raised $100 million at IPO on NASDAQ and another $150 million on a secondary offering. Again, the list goes on, and I think Australia is now the richer for having Russell with us. He was, it isn't mentioned here, also celebrated by the Advanced Network, which is the organisation for expatriate professionals abroad who have their conferences on regular occasions here, as an outstanding leader of Australian technology internationally. So we also have Katherine Woodthorpe, who is chair of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Centre. She also currently serves on the boards of Certex Medical, CRC for Deep Exploration Technologies, and a number of other organisations. She may be known here more as the former chief executive of AVCAL, and I must put in this plug as well that she was awarded an honorary doctorate here at UTS for commercialisation of Australian research. Then finally, Peter Yates, who is well known, I think, to everyone, Deputy Chairman of the Myer Family Investments and Director of AIA Australia. Again, a huge resume here, and I hesitate to read it all out, but he served until 2007 as CEO of Oceania Capital Partners. Well, let's start. And the first and major question for everyone, and I'm just going to go through the group to get separate answers, and then we'll open it up to further questions and discussion. I think this is a great session in which we can bring together the threads of the day. The question for everyone is, we know there's a growing policy interest in the promotion of entrepreneurial startups in Australia, and we are quite good at startups, not great, but good, but certainly less so at scaling up and at the transformation of our current businesses, both large and small. How would you approach these challenges, and where would you focus policy support under this or future governments? Let's start with you, Doron.
Okay. Thanks, Roy. So when you think about businesses scaling, one of the key elements of that, well, there are two key elements. One is management talent, the other is the intellectual property, the offering, the value proposition of the business. And if I just, for the moment, focus on the intellectual property side, to scale a business globally, you really need something that is transformative globally. You really need to set a new bar. And one of the structural problems we have in Australia is that a very, very large proportion of the intellectual property that we generate, which is generated through the public sector, is trapped within our research institutions and finds difficulty in getting commercial expression in a systematic way. We get it. There's obviously there are good examples to demonstrate the art of the possible, but in terms of systematic translation, we really don't achieve anywhere near the same results of our fellow OECD countries. And part of the reason for that goes to the way in which we've structured our research institutions and the incentives and reward structures for our academics. So in answer, one answer to your very large question, and there are many answers, but one answer is that an area that I think government should definitely focus going forward is on the interface between our research community and our business community. And not so much just throwing money at the problem. It's really an understanding of how we can bring together the right skills and money at that interface in order to get more systematic translation of our very large investment in public sector research into our business community. And one way of doing that, well, there are two issues to solving that problem. The first is the incentive schemes, the reward structures for our academics. We've got to stop penalising our academics for getting involved in businesses, even in a modest way. Any kind of venturing outside of the traditional peer-reviewed paper production process acts as a black mark against their professional promotional capabilities, and that's a problem. It means that we've set up a system that incentivises our academic colleagues away from the very activity we would like to see more of. So there's no question we need to address that, not so much in an either-or situation, but more of a both-and situation. There's nothing wrong with rewarding good publications and high-quality citations. I think we need to add to that with the recognition of some of the activities they might pursue beyond simply the production of papers, and start to recognise the impact they have socio-economically as well as through the traditional academic channels. So that's one piece of the puzzle, and that needs to translate both in terms of their capacity to attract subsequent funding, but also in their ability to be promoted within their institutions. The other side of that coin is to recognise that the skills required to translate or begin the commercialisation process of intellectual property are very different to the skills required to generate that basic intellectual property through the research. And we need to understand that we need to bring those skills to that interface. It's an inherently non-commercial interface most of the time. It's not something that the marketplace is going to invest in readily. The IRRs aren't good. You're probably talking a 10 to 15 minimum type return on your investment, 10 to 15 years, rather than the 3 to 5 that a typical venture firm might be looking for. So it's very difficult to attract money to that space, but more importantly, it's really difficult to attract talent to that space, because it's very difficult to convince someone who's doing really well, typically overseas, to come back and sort of run the dice over a single opportunity. So we're looking at the idea of building some venture catalysts, and a venture catalyst is really taking really well-proven management talent, but applying it to a portfolio of very early stage opportunities in a systematic machine which takes the intellectual property and develops it that little bit further so it can start to look attractive to the marketplace. And I think if government were to look at ways in which it can work with the sector, and I don't suggest it should be a straight handout, I think it's more of a help those that help themselves model. But if we as the research institutions are prepared to bite the bullet and invest in that translation work with the right skills, I think if government were to focus there as well, we would get systematically more opportunities getting to that point where they are commercial, and then let the marketplace take care of them. That would then liberate more intellectual property into our SME space and give more of those SMEs a chance of scaling globally because they've got world-leading intellectual property.
Thank you, Doron. Alan, does that sound like a story that you recognise, given your experience in both universities and industry and with the incentives that Doron describes?
Absolutely. I mean, building the connectivity between industry and universities is crucially important. I mean, it's not that universities are the fountain of all knowledge, and the only way we will build productive industry and commercial and other benefits is by starting with universities in a linear sense. But if we didn't capitalise on that, we're missing out on a very big piece of our productive capacity. So I strongly agree, and Doron mentioned, we need to have some way of rewarding researchers for that engagement, for that time that they spent, and Aidan referred to it earlier on today, and so did Ken Boll. And certainly it's something that I can mention as President of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. We have an ongoing project that's been through pilot now and will be submitted to the department to bring a metric to the fore in parallel with the very good metric that Aidan referred to. So the ERA that's run by the ARC does an excellent job of measuring the excellence of research. But no one metric can capture everything that you want to value, and so we'd like to see a metric that measures engagement. I haven't got time to go into how we do that, but a metric that measures engagement between industry and universities put on the table alongside the ERA, so there's more breadth to what we're looking at. But I've got a few other thoughts related to this. Would you like me to speak about them now?
Please
Look,
do.
and I'm not going to dwell on this. There are a lot of things that have either been talked about today or need to be taken into account. I was at a launch of a Monash University Institute of Cognitive and Clinical Neurosciences the other week, and there were a lot of industry partners there. And we did a little exercise around the table asking industry what they would look for, which is not always asked. We do try, but often we forget to do that. And I was surprised that what bubbled to the top, and this was a mixture of large, medium and small companies, including large ones like Siemens and some startups, was a desire to embed some of their industry personnel in the university departments so that they were capturing more than just the final report that comes across, but the skill set and the sort of stuff that your mother doesn't tell you when she gives you a recipe. And the only way you can learn it is by watching her cook. They were trying to capture all of that through embedding people there. So that's one to keep in mind. I think that we need to look at the balance between direct and indirect funding by government of early stage commercialisation research. In other words, what is the role of the tax R&D concession versus direct granting? I'm not going to go into the details of this. Somebody this morning mentioned mobility. We don't allow the sort of mobility that you see at Stanford University and MIT, where they embrace it and people go back and forth all the time. Government purchasing policy, there are a lot of small things, they're individual policies, but what I'd like to comment on are a couple of big things that transcend everything. And one is attitude. It actually stuns me when I travel overseas and I tell people ask where you're from Australia, you get envy. We're a recession-proof economy, we've got the best coffee in the world, not that they all know that, but we have 3 of the 10 best, most livable cities in the world, according to The Economist, and I do trust The Economist. We're actually in a fantastic place. That doesn't mean we couldn't be a lot better. We're in a fantastic place, but if we start with self-flagellation and we're complaining about ourselves all the time, it depresses everybody. And part of entrepreneurship is the belief that you can achieve things. And we need to be celebrating the excellence, and we see it all over the place. We're talking here about engagement. There are fantastic examples in this country. Rio Tinto has invested tens of millions of dollars working with University of Sydney and UQ. At Monash, we've got Glaxo, we've got Pfizer, we've got lots and lots of big multinational companies investing a lot of money in the research that we do in a collaborative partnership with them. You see Dow Chemicals investing, BHP's no slouch. There are fantastic examples and you don't hear about them as much as you hear about the fact that there's not enough engagement. What we should be doing is focusing on the engagement that's there and building on it, rather than focusing on the engagement that's not there and criticising it and wondering about what we can do. So just want to leave you with one of 2 thoughts, big picture thoughts. One is attitude. The second is, what is the process for developing policies and strategies? And of course, there are 2 ways that you can do it. You can say, look, if we can, and this could apply equally to a company or a government. One is to say, here are good things that we're capable of doing. And if we do enough of these good things, let's call them policies, let's call them strategies, if we do enough of these individual, independent good things, we'll end up in a wonderful place. And that can work, but you don't actually get to control where you end up. And the other is to create a map of where you want to be. So that is our vision for 5 or 10 years from now. And now and you do that without consideration of budget or resources. You say that's what we want to be. And now let's think about the footpaths we can traverse to get there, given the realities of budget and resource limitations. And I do think we tend to do the former, and probably most governments do around the world, rather than the latter. But it's certainly my experience as a business person that the latter, where you map out the target and then think about how you can traverse various pathways to get there, is better. And that's a big picture thing that I'd like at some stage in some country in the world, hopefully Australia, to be used as an approach to improving what we've got.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Russell, you must be an optimist. You've come back to Australia after 30 years abroad. What brought you back, and how do you see the evolution of our innovation system in relation to SMEs and startups?
So in truth, what brought me back was sheer luck and family issues. I always wanted to come back, said I would come back because I came from a poor family and lived off the taxpayer's dollar to get through high school and university, but never did until family life meant that I came back. And now I'm so glad that I did and pleased that I can help in some way. I'm going to take the perspective of the small companies rather than the university. A small company begins with intellectual property that its founder or founders created themselves alone, or that they in-license from university by whatever mechanism, and let's assume that can be fixed. In the United States, I learned that that really needs three things, and I've thrown my notes away because the other speakers have addressed some of it. You must have nurturing smart capital at the beginning of a company that knows how to advise the founders, who really know nothing but the technology or the science, how to create good IP with the minimum funds in the shortest possible time. And then the people around the company with those nurturing dollars need to figure out how to hire other people around the company who will create additional value in leadership and making tough decisions going forward. So you need nurturing dollars, you need an innovative environment, and you need management. And in the United States, I was able to always get people who were far better than me at practically everything else. And provided you had the initial money, the initial 5 million, you could attract people to come and join me because here's the great idea we've got, and you're going to come and be a founder, and we'll all share in the upside, and you and your family will be transformed forever if, by 1% luck, we ever make it out the other end. And so that works, and people will take that chance. Back here in Australia, after 2 years, I am convinced that the level of creativity and invention in research is as great or greater than anywhere in the world. I have no doubt of that. And I'm not trying to make anyone feel happy. It's really incredible, the level of invention here. I'm also amazed that it is possible to raise money here. And this is what surprises me. With a technology that was invented by a single person here, a woman, we were able to raise here over the last 6 months, a very short time, $10 million, with only one rejection in about 25 people. And that money, to my amazement, was all from high net worths. All from high net worths who are lawyers, clinicians, successful business people, bankers, financiers, not one of them technically astute in anything that we sold to them. So how did we do it? And if I can do it, other people can do it. It was because the business proposition was very tight. We had a really good business plan, great IP that is going through the Australian Patent Office and getting ticks in the box, and a really good management team. And built around myself and a couple of other people, we have got a really stellar executive board where everyone on the board has put money in, and we've all had experience in the United States, and we're all experts in our fields, and it was then, I have been amazed, a relatively simple matter to educate very smart people, all of them in Sydney, invest in us, and we raised 10 million. So money is not the issue. It's access to that money that is clearly an issue, because what I've described is purely idiosyncratic and pretty tragic if you didn't have my connections or luck. So somehow the young people who start up a company here and have a great idea have got to be able to access all the smart people in town who are prepared to take a risk on something if it is appropriately presented to them as a business proposition. And it must be fully baked. It must be 3 books of an investment memorandum together with a really killer PowerPoint and the ability to sell the story in 30 seconds. And you go through that, and to my amazement, a few 1-hour meetings and we have got $10 million. So the money is there, and it's smart money. It's high net worth money. These people have not forced on us terrible plans of ripping us off if we fail on a timeline. They're just encouraging us to go ahead. So the money is there, the smarts are there. What are we lacking? We have too few managers and people who've done it before. And part of that can't be invented overnight, because until you have a successful industry, it's the old negative story of until you have success, how can you get other people to come into that industry? And I note that right now we are building, in my field, the life sciences, a very successful set of companies beyond medical devices, which is not biotechnology. We are building now some successful biotechs in the health sphere and in the agribusiness, and with success will come the ability to attract back 1 million Australians who are overseas, and most of them are not working on ski slopes or bars. You have 1 million Australians who are really talented people working overseas, and they're holding down great jobs, not from friendship, but because they're better than the other people around them. So we've got to attract them back. So we have to track them back, as my colleagues have said, with a good incentives scheme, and I believe the government is fixing that, where you can earn money and not be ashamed about it and have to give it all back to the taxpayer. Where you are, interestingly, we have to get through the tall poppy syndrome, and that's another topic. I had 1 year of not being able to talk to anybody. I didn't exist until some events happened. That's tragic. And again, it was idiosyncratic luck to break through that. So we've got to solve the tall poppy syndrome. We've got to solve access to all the smart money in town, and we've got to train people to be able to present their stuff. So I think we have the ingredients, except the management, to go past the universities, past the founders, into how do you create the discipline to focus, live or die by your output as dollars spent over time, and deliver something into a market that is the VC or the strategic partner who will say, oh my God, you've spent 6 months or 9 months, your value on paper has gone up by tenfold. I agree, I'll give you more money at less dilution, or I want a strategic partnership. And I have been upset here today to hear not one person say that industry is outside Australia. The industry that our Australian companies as SMEs or startups should be talking to is not Australian, for God's sakes. Australian companies, most of them, of international renown, they are simply distribution and sales centres, right? They are not the place that innovates and controls the world of pharmaceuticals or drugs, the world I'm in. So the market for industrialisation, and you must have that strategic validation, is global. So Australians have to sit here and say, I'm in the university, I'm outside the university, I've invented something great, they need that nurturing, and then they have to be thinking global. Their partner and their competition is not down the road, it's overseas. And we're good enough to do that, for God's sakes, if we have the appropriate nurturing to keep that value here, great IP, great management, to take the skills forward.
Great, thank you. What is your advice, Katherine, for the next generation of globalising Russell Howards? You have experience in the nurturing smart capital sector. What would your advice be on how to nurture this new generation, which has to be much deeper and wider than it currently is, although we do have some great examples?
Well, I'd have to say that having spent 20 odd years working with startups out of Australia, most of them think global from day one. You know, there's certainly if you use the word technology broadly, ranging from biosciences through to ICT, they all know that their businesses will grow overseas, and that's, other than testing it here, that's the marketplace. So I think that's a given to start with. And in terms of the money, I think that one of the biggest problems has been there's not many people like you who have those connections, and most early stage companies, they might find some seed funding and angel funding, but when you're getting to those $10 million licks, etc., you need to be thinking more about more venture capital style, not least because it's an aggregation of money. So you don't have to find a big range of contacts to get your 10 million. You actually have a smaller field that you need to go and present to. And in Australia, venture capital's been going backwards for the last several years, certainly during the 7 years that I was at AvCal. And there's a number of factors, and a couple of those are really quite important ones. One is the lack of patience in investment in Australia. And again, if you look at ICT, you can often start to get returns in a smaller time frame. In the life sciences, we've just had a couple of huge exits, HatchTech, SpinFX, before that Fibratech, is it? They've been, 7 to 12 year time frames that the VCs have been invested in them. And in the meantime, the investors into those VC funds have got bored and gone home and gone, you never give me a return. So we need to educate our investors, and by that I mean the pool of funds Larry referred to, the $2 trillion that we have in our super funds. One of their problems is this lack of patience. A second problem with them is that as they've grown bigger, their inclination to invest those, what for them are small licks of money, has actually reduced. So they say, to quote them, it's too small, I can't manage that many small investments, small being 50 mil, or that's sort of about. And even if they kicked, right out of the ballpark, it wouldn't move the dial, so why would I bother? And there's no sense, and what I try to get across, particularly to the industry funds, and a couple of them do understand this, and I'd have to really give Host Plus and First State Super a huge tick for this. They get it that actually this is where their next generation of members' jobs are going to come from. And it's not just about making an investment for any sense of sort of moral rectitude or being part of the community, but they actually understand there's also an economic imperative that if they want members in the future, those people have to have jobs or they aren't paying into super funds. And so a couple of them are starting to get that. But equally, when they get bigger, they know that they can go and invest in Excel, and they have access to large VCs overseas. So we have this conundrum that we have the fourth largest pool of funds in the world, based here in Australia, and yet their inclination to invest in venture capital is zil. I mentioned two. They're pretty much the only two. And I think that's tragic. And we talked at AVCAL about things like, for example, in some of the states of the US, to give some solution answers, X%, and we're talking of basis points or percentages of basis points, should be invested in early stage or venture capital or some sort of way of that's going to actually funnel that into this sort of area. Or it could be an opt-out, so everyone is opted in unless they say, look, I don't want my money in that stuff, I'm opting out. But there are ways, because if you ask anyone around your dinner table and say, do you think your super fund should invest less than 0.1% into early stage Australian technology companies? I'd say pretty well without exception, they'll go yes. We're talking such tiny sums. So I think we need to get some sort of will that other places have managed, some of the, as I said, the states, I think Montana, for example, and maybe some of the bigger ones as well, have just said, you will do 5%, whatever it is. So that's my kind of VC rant. But I'd like to bring up a completely different subject as well, because you did also mention transforming larger companies. I do a lot of work with the AICD, and one thing that cracks me up is the lack of digital awareness, technology awareness, ability, background experience on our larger company boards. And I mean the ASX 300, so I'm not talking just the really big companies. So I talked to them, I raised it in an open forum of talking about diversity, and we talked about gender a lot, and I won't comment on the panels, gender diversity. But I said, well, what about skills diversities on our boards as well? Where's the scientist on your board? Where's the technologist? We might have an engineer if you're really forward-thinking, but we've got the lawyers, we've got the accountants, we've got the businessmen. Where are the scientists who will go, but why are we doing this? And the answer I got back was so facetious, the whole room took a sort of sharp intake of breath. But, well, we used to kind of have one of everything, and we even each had a poet on the board. And the whole room went, what? What a facetious answer. So I tackled this particular senior chairman afterwards and said, that was a facetious answer, and he sort of semi-accepted that. And he said, but we don't need the IT guy. And I went, you just have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? I'm not talking about the person who did the SAP rollout. We're talking about somebody who understands the world around. And what I find from them, I chair a lot of round tables, senior boardroom level, and I ask them how many of them are on social media. That's for management. So you don't go hashtag my company in the morning to find out what they're saying about you? Well, why would I do that? So they see technology as a piece of equipment, a widget. They don't understand we're talking about business models that are so disruptive that their businesses will not be here tomorrow certainly not in 10, 50 years' time, if they don't get it. And they're not going to get it saying that's management's issue, and we'll just hope that whatever they tell us is okay, because we don't understand what they're reporting to us. So one of the things I'm trying to push with AICD and others is how do we lift up the digital awareness, the science awareness on our boards, because the future of Australia, if it's going to be more than a quarry, a farm and a tourism beach, is that we need to have companies that are nimble enough to move with the times. Great to grow startups, but we've got an awful lot of companies with an awful lot of jobs that we can't afford to lose in the meantime. How are we going to get them to move with the times as well?
Okay.
Rant over.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic.
Sorry, Peter. I'll leave you to it.
Peter, now it's to you. Obviously, in Australia, as Katherine was saying, we have a great appetite for short-term risk, as we'll find when we come to your horse race in a couple of weeks' time. But long-term risk is another matter altogether. Does the buck stop with you?
I wish it did, but we've heard so many other presentations today. Congratulations also on the conference. I found the panels that I've attended to be terrific, and I think the engagement is wonderful. Look, I think the most important thing, and Alan touched on it, is attitude, which is culture. And how exciting is it that for the first time we have a Prime Minister who's not a lawyer, who's not a banker, he's actually, fundamentally, sure, he's got a legal background, but he's an entrepreneur. And I think when a nation steps up and says, actually, we are capable of being innovative, when we are capable of being entrepreneurs, and we support that activity, then, it starts at the top. And we haven't really had that. We've had an environment of, after all, 60% of the ASX are substantially risk-averse companies. Mining companies and banking substantially, plays around known commodities or known outcomes whereby you can raise huge amounts of finance. I mean, that's not, sure, in the small mining sector there's obviously lots of risk, but generally our business model for Australia is around certain paradigms which are highly culturally risk-averse. And kind of that reflects the fact that our job as a colony was just to sort of send stuff back and do our job, and that's it, and it's taken us a long time to grow up and get over that. And I'm excited by the fact that I think we have grown up, and we're starting to see all over the place the seeds of getting over that. As Russell said, sometimes when I hear the conversation about raising money, I'm a bit confused as well. I've got my public listed social media company on NASDAQ called Moco. I think we've toasted about $35–40 million. We spend $2 million a month in negative cash flow, and people still keep throwing money at us. God knows why, but oops, I shouldn't have said that's public listed. So actually pull that back. So I don't think that is an issue. I think people who have ideas, who don't know how to frame them, who can't get the money, appropriately complain about it. But I don't think that's the fundamental issue. I think, as Russell says, if you have a really solid idea backed by a solid group of people, and sure, you've got to be smart enough to have somebody in your group who's an insider, that happens all the time, doesn't it? So, and sometimes it's difficult to get those insiders to come and join your camp. Why? Because you don't want them, giving you stick, which is code word for a kind mentor. And so there's a reluctance sometimes to do that. But if you get those things together, I think in Australia you can raise significant amounts of money. Now, I still think it's a little bit harder to raise, so the first $5–10 million I don't think is a huge issue. There's somebody in the room here I've been working with recently, so I know they're smiling at me for various reasons, because we've been struggling a little bit. But fundamentally, if you get it together, you can raise it. So I think distributing that knowledge and getting that knowledge better known is only emerging in Australia in the last 10 or 15 years. And I don't see that's our problem. I think in terms of the short-termism, people say to me, well, Peter, why do you have so many entrepreneurial activities? I think people around here might know I'm the largest shareholder in InLink, which is the elevator business. I've got Third Screen Media, digital media business. I've got Moco. I've got a whole bunch of these things. And I said, well, look, I knew people who talk about they collect the young Australian artists. because in 10 or 15 years' time, they've had them hanging on their wall and think they're going to be worth a poultice. Well, I collect the young Australian entrepreneur because my experience is that if you wait for 10 or 15 years' time and give them a bit of a hand, on balance they'll get there, unless they're crazy. On balance they get there. You're not going to get every artist right, but you have to have that approach. It's like collecting art. It's going to take a while to mature. I think in that sense, part of the media play, which is innovation has to be about somebody who's around about 24 or 25 years old making $500 million in the first, 1.5 months of them thinking up the idea. We need to kind of get over that because actually that's not helping our culture develop what's really involved. We need to remind people it is a 5-10 year cycle and that they can then work on that and engage with that and become more confident about that. I think the final point I'd like to raise is some of the dialogue that takes place in forums like this is the mismatch between the science industry as a supplier wanting to have its world enhanced in any way possible, which also includes the institution of the universities, versus the innovator and the entrepreneur who may have absolutely no engagement with science. I mean, sure, I fund Susan Greenfield's Alzheimer's research in the UK, but generally for me personally, I actually don't think I've put a lot of money into a big, what I would call biotech play. In fact, most of the entrepreneurs I've been involved in have not even gone near a university. And so the debate we need to be quite clear what the debate's about. Because the small SME, my architect, whose daughter created an online pyjama selling program, she's an entrepreneur, right? So what are we doing to help her? So we just need to be careful about understanding the conversation that's going on here, because both are important fields. We need to support them both. And yes, we may well be able to capitalise on all the public money that goes into research if we can better get those connections, and that's very important. And I sit on the ARC advisory board, and Aidan and I and the other board members have been working at how we can add to this. But let's not overlook the core conversation. You've got SMEs, you've got entrepreneurs, many of whom are never going to have any engagement with mainstream research, and that's fine. And then we have all this fabulous research that needs to find an engagement partner, and that's a separate problem. And today, I think what we need to do is recognise that both of those need to be solved. But I come back to what Alan said. It comes around to cultural attitude, expectation, timelines, incentives. And I think if we get that right over the next few years, and we've got the right Prime Minister to help us do that now, I think we could surprise ourselves in a really, really big way. So I'm very positive.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So, time to open it up to questions and comments.
We've talked a bit about today about private investment, the super funds, and I think that's where there's a huge amount of liquidity around the world, and I think governments are going broker and broker, and I think we shouldn't look to government anymore except for maybe being an enabler. But I'm wondering if 0.1% is enough, because if I'm on the investment side of the equation, I'm thinking, why would I bother with 0.1%? It's not going to give me enough of a return to make an impact on the portfolio. It's just going to be a nuisance to me. And so I think part of the issue is getting the scale attractive enough to that to those funds that are managing large amounts of funding, and maybe that's where government can help more to get that scale of investment that makes it attractive enough. I'm just wondering, have we got the scale right, and what else do we need to do to attract that private sector investment?
Russell first.
Scale is one issue, and we could debate that. And the other is why do people invest in one fund versus another? So there's experience in the US that people will invest in a fund if it dedicates a proportion of its resources to, let's say, renewable energy, or to Alzheimer's disease, or etc. So it would be reasonable to say a fund is going to put so much of its money into family health or whatever you want. Pick a problem and pick 5 problems and say this fund is going to invest its 0.1% or its 1% in those problems. And that actually would stimulate all of those areas. And I think people will make choices. They like to feel that, my God, I think they're interesting problems. I'll pick that super fund versus the next one. Some will be green, some will be health, some will be indigenous affairs, some will be, interaction with Asia, whatever.
I think, just picking up on Peter's point before, it's not a money supply side problem. There's money. evidenced by the size of the super funds. But venture capital as an institutional investment class is a lagging indicator of an innovative ecosystem. It's not a leading indicator, right? You don't wake up in the morning as a venture capitalist and say, how can I help society by investing in bad deals so that eventually they become good? I don't think like that as a VC. Never have, never will, and nor should I, because I'm investing for LPs that want to get a return on their money. So the real issue is the deal flow, right? You've got to have evidence of quality deal flow, and the proof is there to be seen. Katherine mentioned Fibratech and Hatchtech. As a result of Fibratech, MRCF, which was a relatively small venture fund, was able then to raise a $200 million fund, including from superannuation funds. The money immediately responded to performance. Blackbird has just raised $200 million, including a decent lick from superannuation funds. The money's responding to performance. So the money will come after the good opportunities kick in. And if you have a look at every ecosystem around the world, including all of the ones people always cite, you know, Israel and the Valley and so on, if you go back far enough in history, you'll see that the first thing that happened was the success. Then the venture money came. Venture capitalists, by their nature, are just trying to make a buck, yeah? They're not in it for the social engineering piece. So let's focus on the quality of the deal flow. Let's focus on the attitude that Alan and Russell have mentioned in terms of promoting the successes. Because the other problem with Australia is when we do get the successes, we don't crow about them quite like the way that our friends over the Pacific do. So we've got to make a little bit more of our success. But clearly, even in our market, which for 7 years was dormant, as soon as we got success, they woke up.
Catherine, did you want to?
I'd only say the trouble is that lag can sometimes just in an economy as small as ours, notwithstanding Israel's manages it through other reasons, but the peaks and troughs end up that the lag's always such a lag that by the time they then start investing again, it's all too late, and so we end up always missing the boat. Your comments, I think, are really interesting because a lot of the super funds have a natural place that they would be HESTA in health. And so on, and quite a few of those are already thinking that way in some of their other investment classes, and certainly there's no reason why they wouldn't then follow that investment thesis through a bit as well. And in terms of the size, you also don't want to flood the market either, because that doesn't help anybody. If there's too much money in the market, there's no tension and more bad deals will get done. So you have to be careful not to overdo it either. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that. We've seen a lot of poorly performing funds which have set us backwards. Now, is it their fault? It doesn't matter whose fault it is, because venture capitalists don't care whose fault it is. They just don't see the deals making money, so they'll go somewhere else. It's a global business. The tier one venture players, they're all over the world. They'll go anywhere where there's good deals to be had.
And they're investing here.
When there's a good deal to be had, they do it.
Alan, did you want to add to
Just
that?
bring together Katherine and Doron's comments. So Katherine mentioned there's not enough patient capital. It takes a long time to get these projects to their commercial stage.
And the life of the fund.
And sometimes. And Doron mentioned that money responds to performance, and there's sort of they're antitheses of each other. And I think it indicates the need for some actual government funding to help there, because the performance problem to some extent is because ideas leave universities prematurely. People tend to believe that in America things just walk out of universities, get picked up by the venture capitalists, and money flows. But in fact, there's a lot more direct support for that early stage commercialisation research from government in America than here, through a number of mechanisms, not worth going into, but ranges from defence to the Small Business Innovation Research Program.
Absolutely.
And so the ideas actually do get taken closer to being a proven technology. They're not all the way there, but they're closer before you ask those venture capitalists or the high net worth individuals to come in. And the only way to really solve that, other than a miracle, is for governments to be a little bit more involved. And then you solve two problems at the same time. You don't have the lack of performance, which turns the next generation of VCs off, and you don't have these elongated development times that are so long that the investors run out of patience. So
And the research tax incentive we have here is a really good structure. I mean, I believe there's only 2 countries in the world that have it, Israel and Australia, where a little company spends money in R&D and then you get 48% back. 45. So it's a brilliant scheme because in the little companies that I'm in, you actually plan it in your budget. And provided we have sufficient consistency in civil service and government that the policy remains, you plan it in your budget, you spend on that work, knowing that you can now calculate that return. And it's often a lot of money. It can be $500,000, $2 million, whatever, for a little company. So it's a wonderful positive feedback loop, and it's the opposite of this ridiculous business of saying, oh, you get a tax saving in the end when you have a product. You mightn't get that far. So this is a really good scheme that we have in Australia.
Yes, sure.
The consistency issue, to pick up on that, and SBIR was mentioned, and that's 35 years old now. And if there's one thing I hear from companies, it's just stop changing it. So how many times have they been in the middle of a particular grant mechanism? They've spent money, they've spent time and distraction, and suddenly the rug's pulled out from under them. I was on Doron's board at Commercialisation Australia. Same thing happened. Rugs pulled out from under you when companies have invested. Really, for tiny companies, a lot of time and money and energy. And so the most important thing I'd always say to government is just, can we stop? Can we just, we've got a great program there, can we leave it alone for quite a long time? Because we can't even assess it in 5 years. We need to assess it in 20 years.
Can I just make a comment on that too? I'd just like to talk out both sides of my mouth on this, because I've been debating the R&D grant. On the one hand, it's fantastic. So you take my small companies that I just referred to, or Russell referred to, small companies. I mean, that was the only thing that kept them alive. At the end of each August or September, we'd get Ernst & Young or some accounting firm to pile up the paper, shove it in, and thank God we'd get $300,000 or $500,000 of equity back into the business, and we lasted. So there's hundreds of small entrepreneurial companies doing that all over Australia, and they survive off that. On the other hand, if I sit there with my ARC hat on and we're having a conversation with government about, okay, when government says, look, we already put $9 billion into research, or $9.5 billion into research, why should we put any more in? You go, well, actually, the R&D grant money is $2.5 billion. It's pretty undirected stuff. Maybe we should actually be being a little bit more focused rather than having my marvellous suite of companies just coming up with whatever idea they can and running down to the tax office and getting a $300,000 or $500,000 rebate. Now, this is the debate between the industry of science and university and high-end research wanting to commercialise that and do more, and let's get a better outcome of that, versus what really innovation is in the SME sector. And I think we just need to call out there are both sides to that conversation.
Just picking up on that, government policy making is it's done without an evidence base. So you can argue the toss on exactly these points till you're blue on the face. You won't have a reliable evidence base to substantiate your argument fully one way or the other, which means that the space becomes fundamentally contestable. Meaning that you come along, one group of policy people can say we should do X, and then the next month they'll come along and say we'll do Y, and there is no way of arbitrating whether X is better than Y or Y is better than X. It becomes a matter of opinion, and when you're relying on opinion, as you can imagine in Canberra, you get interesting results. So one of the things that could be done and should be done is we should start mapping some of the ecosystems that we're playing in terms of the actual facts on the ground, which we can do, which government uniquely can do. So I'll give you an example. If you take the medical technology space, there are a number of data sets that exist within government today that have never been correlated. The R&D tax incentive, the therapeutic goods register, the patent office, the NHMRC grant funding. All of these different schemes, be they grants, be they taxation points or whatever, whether it be the regulator, they're all generating data sets. Correlating those data sets so you can actually interrogate them over time and understand trends over time based on policy positions is actually the only way of really concluding whether or not we're making any progress. But we don't do it. We don't look at it. For example, if I'm doing medical research in a university, I want to understand in aggregate, what is the conversion from the research funded by NHMRC, the patents lodged with IP Australia, and the sorts of R&D tax incentive monies that are being claimed by SME in our marketplace? Who knows? We could know, we don't know. And we don't know because we're not asking the question, and we're not prepared to do the work that's required in order to bring those data sets together so we have a reliable map that we can interrogate. So I think when we discuss what government should and shouldn't do, we can have the discussion as it has been had for decades now, and we'll go around in circles, and as Katherine said, we'll start a program, close it down, bring it back again with another name, whatever we do, right? But we're never going to answer the real questions unless we start using our smarts and start mapping all the data sets that we are collecting and use them.
So, very important point, evidence. Other countries, we know the Nordic countries do it, we know UK, Germany do it, technology and knowledge foresights. Where do we want to be based on our capabilities in 5 or 10 years' time, and how do we map the pathway towards those objectives? We've got, as we heard earlier, the new industry growth centres. These emerged out of the innovation precincts under the previous Labor government. Did they come out of a technology foresight? No. They were a guess, a very educated guess, but a guess nonetheless as to where we needed to place a lot of our dollars. So big consequences from identifying those areas. In the US, simultaneously, a few years ago, they undertook their Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Program, which was resulted in a very concise set of recommendations, only a few pages, but behind it lay 5 volumes of research into exactly the issues that Doron has just highlighted. So there is a challenge for us in bringing the evidence to bear on decisions which have major consequences for our economy and use a lot of those resources, the 9.7 billion that we outlined earlier as the envelope. And it's unlikely that will be increased by any government in the near term. It's really a matter of how best we use it. But any more questions and comments, please?
How does one recognise a dud project, and how do you shut them down to minimise the financial liabilities and failures? I think,
Excellent question.
I know this sounds a negative way to finish the afternoon, but it is a terribly important question to maintain the viability of these startups, a lot of whom haven't been viable for all that.
Absolutely. So who's shut down the dud project?
I'm happy to make a fairly glib answer, and then I'll ask, perhaps colleagues can expand on it. But I think what you described on both aspects is the job of a venture capital company. So you've got super funds or high net worth individuals or others with money who don't have the capacity to look at individual projects. They contribute to a $200 million fund, and the venture capitalist experts put that into 15 different companies, and that's your portfolio. And it's up to those experts to shut down the ones that aren't doing. And by the way, I agree with you. It's so much harder to shut down something than to start something up. But I think what you're describing is the role of venture capital, which, as we've heard, hasn't done terribly well in Australia. But if we can, but it's possibly coming back a little now, if we can optimise that, it would be terrific.
So if I can just interrupt, you don't see it as a management role?
Well, it's the management role of the investment committee and the managers within the venture capital company to do what you described.
Yes,
There's self-selection as well. If the project is not funded by anybody, then you disappear into the sunset. And that works. In the US, it works all the time. And the other comment on the portfolio is a very important point, and I will say that the company that we were able to raise 10 million for, with a 90% hit rate, was funded because it had a portfolio of 10 products and a very little amount of money to be spent per product until it reaches commercialisation through an international manufacturer and path to market. In other words, it's obvious that a portfolio allows you to fail at some percent at the time and still net have a commercial enterprise. So if a company is lucky enough in Australia to have a platform technology and lucky enough that the turning of the wheel to create a product worth money is a very little amount of money, then that's a brilliant path. Because then you don't need venture capital, which of course has to have a portfolio of shots with a frequency of 1 chance in 10, and then they'll hopefully make a lot of money. But a technology platform, if and only if turning the crank is inexpensive, is a very lucky way to be.
I think we've got room for one more question.
I'm just hearing a bit of a mixed message here, in the sense that you want some constancy from government, not to tinker with things. But on the other hand, we want a change of culture broadly in our society, where we want actually government to be innovative as well, I would assume. So where do we get innovation within government, and how does that fit in with the broader ecosystem that doesn't sort of trash the initiatives that SMEs might be doing? I mean, can we do a lot better in that space, and is it important for our government to be an innovator as well?
Peter.
I think that in the research sector, we've had absolutely appropriately a single focus on research excellence. And there's a big difference between excellence and effectiveness. And there's a big difference between excellence and effectiveness and innovation. And I think this is part of our cultural problem. And I don't want to suggest that we should fund less research excellence, because I'm passionate about excellence. But I think we need to widen out the conversation within our culture about what I'm there for. And a university culture where, you get into the best university because you've got the best marks, you go forward because you pass the exams the best, that you then, you go through this professional training of being good at constantly achieving on the excellence paradigm is important. I don't want to take away from that. But that has been the dominant thesis in our culture for the last pretty much 40 years as far as research has been concerned. And I think we need to ask ourselves, is that right? And that's a cultural issue. It's nothing to do with government.
Thanks. And one more question.
What would each of you recommend that we do if we had $1 billion extra in this general area?
$1 billion extra to spend, unlikely though it may seem.
I'll begin, then I can relax. So I think the challenge for me as an Australian is how to stop creating value by shipping off dirt and animals as what we do in our country. And so how do we create more value in the value chain where normally other people make the money overseas? And so that's the basic question, how to retain value. And that means in different fields, you would progress along the value chain to different extents. So in the Northern Territory, you might be figuring out how to, rather than shipping off live animals, create some food products from those animals. Or in the life sciences, you might be figuring, let's just make sure we help everyone do a phase 1 trial and a phase 2A in Australia, and then sell it off overseas. So there'll be different points that make sense for different fields. And I think our government knows what the big areas are that we can capitalise on in our country. There's about 4 or 5, and figure out how to stimulate those areas.
Right. Alan.
Is this real money we're talking about? Great. I tend to divide the complete end-to-end innovation spectrum into 3. There's the excellent research that we've been talking about, Peter was just referring to, and we actually do that well. Can we do it better? Of course, but we do it very well, and it's well known that we do. And then at the end point, I actually believe that we've got not just a few, but a lot of companies that are capable of taking proven technologies and commercialising them internationally very, very well. And that's the end point you want to be at. The research is the beginning of the chain. Where we come up short is what Larry was talking about this morning, getting the research outcomes, converting them into proven technologies. And I don't think we've got the formula yet. I would like to see the whole of that $1 billion spent on some programs that are actually, through a competitive process, analysing what's there, supporting the feasibility studies, the early commercialisation research to turn outcomes into proven technologies. Then leave the pickup to the companies. We've already got the excellent work doing. But in terms of consistency, I think one of the best things about the new Prime Minister, who's going to give us $1 billion, I guess the best is that he's going to give us $1 billion. But the second best is that he talks like an entrepreneur about the need to always be in beta test. Beta test means you're actually putting the product out there, listening to your customers, trying it out, seeing what your sales are. That's the evidence. In a real company, if the dollars are coming in through sales revenue, that's evidence you've got a good product. If they're not, you move on. So I do admire consistency, but only if the product's right. And I think many times in Australia, they've thrown out, and it's been badly done, it's been almost arbitrary, but we have replaced programs because the evidence hasn't been there that they're good. We haven't found the formula yet. So maybe take 10% of the $1 billion just for planning, and then put the $1 billion into that middle section. I think Larry referred to it as the valley of death, through a really focused competitive process, but with awareness that what we do might not be right, and we've got to be agile, not thoughtless. Sometimes we've been thoughtless. We've got to be agile in replacing what we try.
So a minute each for Katherine, Doron, Peter.
Billions, a lot of money in the sort of programs that we're normally talking about. Some of what you've been talking about is Commercialisation Australia. And I think one of its biggest successes was not just the money that we helped people doing early stage planning, building their business plans, doing trials right up to phase 2As, in fact, but also the case managers that we had around Australia who did an amazing job mentoring, helping, working through those business plans. That was a terrific aid to those companies in terms of really getting them over the hump of that early commercialisation phase. And the other thing I'd like to spend some money on is revisiting what many countries do, and we kind of had in the IIF of the government co-investing with venture capital, whether it's through a co-investment fund that then invests as a fund of funds into VCs, or whether it co-invests one per one with VCs, that actually smooths out some of those peaks and troughs for venture capital funding. And you know, out of the IIF, we got Seek, we got LookSmart, we got Hitwise, we got the three I mentioned earlier, we got Gecko, we got a lot of great companies that are doing very well globally out of that program in the past, and there was no evidence to suggest that it shouldn't have kept going.
Doron?
You get lucky last, Doron.
I get lucky last.
No, and Peter.
Oh, sorry, Peter, I thought you went first.
So, Prime Minister for the day, huh? So, you know, honestly, I'd pay down debt with $1 billion, and I would... and I would spend the 9.7 billion smarter. I think there's a lot of waste in our system. I think a lot of it is misdirected. I think government thinks it's got a more significant role in certain areas than it really does have. And I think before you start throwing more money, you've got to understand what it is you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And I just don't think enough depth of understanding there. I agree with Katherine in terms of Commercialisation Australia, what it did, but it's a very small proportion of 9.7 billion. It's minuscule proportion of 9.7 billion.
If I remember rightly.
82 million a year, yeah. And that's at its full incarnation. So we're talking a very small amount of money. 9.7 billion is being spent. To Peter's point, there's 2.5 billion plus on the R&D tax incentive, which is undirected. It's entirely eligibility based. That may or may not be a bad thing, but it needs to be looked at, and we need to understand what problems we're really trying to solve. And I just don't believe, and I've been there for 5 years in the bowels of it all, I don't believe there is a sufficient depth of understanding of the actual problem to then be throwing more money at the same people who don't understand the problem.
I'd put $900 million into the Australian University Industry IP Fund, and so that if your university won't fund the IP that you've created, you can take all your IP and get funding from this fund, but the scientists, the university, everybody have to put the package in on the same terms. It's a defined package, no ifs or buts, and so what that would do in one fell swoop, it would stop the nonsense that we've got here, whereby we've got multiple universities in these incredibly important projects. They can't work out over at ANU, they tend not to want to pay for any IP, because they think they're doing the Australian community service by funding the research, which is fantastic. You've got Melbourne University says that we've got so much IP I can't afford anymore. And so if you're in one of these big complicated research projects, the IP is just an absolute, I won't use the first language, but it's a muddle. And if we had a fund of $900 million that basically solved that problem for us, I think we'd see a huge uplift in Australia. The remaining $100 million, I just simply put it into the Quantum Computing Centre because it's the most important thing we have in Australia. So I'm completely biased and I sit on the board.
Yep. I'll give you my 100 as well. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and I think everyone will agree this has been an excellent discussion of very high calibre and making a huge contribution, I think, to our understanding of where our innovation system goes next. So thank you to our panellists. Thank you everyone for coming.